Welcome, everyone. How are we doing? Good. Left side's better than the right. Love to hear it. My name is Brett Alexander, he, him, and I'm the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Program Manager here at SJ Quinney. We're really excited as we've been doing a whole week of MLK events. And as we dive into today, we're really excited to welcome two really impressive researchers, professors, and really just prolific members in the community. And so keeping in mind, I do want to mention we had another panelist who was unable to attend today's event, Dr. Tinu Kanaka, who was an expert in civil rights and community building. She was unable to attend due to a family emergency, so she sends her best and regrettably will not be here today. And so that really does narrow our focus of today's panel from tying into a couple of other elements throughout the week and really honing in on community and well-being. So as you are listening today online and in person, keep that in mind. We are going to have opportunities for you to submit some questions via Slido that will be read, and then some of our presenters here will be able to answer those as they come up and as they relate to community and well-being. And from there, I'm going to read some quick introductions about our wonderful panelists today as we dive into it. And then we're going to go ahead and launch off. If you are looking at Slido to submit some questions, make sure you use hashtag #ULaw. So starting off, we have Dr. Cliff Roski with us today. Cliff Roski is a professor at the University of Utah, here, BTW, where he teaches courses on constitutional law, criminal law, and mindfulness. Roski has spent 15 years working as a scholar of and advocate for LGBTQ rights. In recent years, he has begun teaching a course called Mindful Lawyering, which examines the relationship between the practice of meditation and the practice of law. He's been practicing meditation for more than 20 years and is certified as a mindfulness teacher by UCLA and the International Mindfulness Teachers Association. He has served in leadership roles with the Utah State Bar Well-Being Committee, the Mindfulness in Law Society, and the Balance and Well-Being section of the American Association of Law Schools. His recent scholarship includes Mindful Lawyering, a pilot study on mindfulness training for law students, a peer-reviewed study of the well-being of students in his mindfulness course. He is currently working on an article called Measuring Lawyer Mental Illness, which draws upon national representative surveys to compare the rates of mental illness and substance abuse among lawyers to the rates among other groups. Go ahead and give it up for Cliff, everyone. And our next presenter over here to the left, your right, yes, we have Martha Knudsen, a JD and MAPP. Martha is a lawyer, speaker, and a consultant working at the intersection of the legal profession and the science of well-being. One of the first people to specialize in this area, Martha is passionate about using evidence-based well-being strategies to drive professional success, working with both private clients and as the director of the Utah State Bar's Well-Being Committee. So really excited to share some of the research done there in that regard. In a prior life, Martha practiced law, graduating law school magna cum laude in 1999. During her legal career, she litigated in private law firm practice, rising to the rank of shareholder and later becoming the general counsel of a leading national real estate management company. While still practicing law full-time, in 2015, Martha earned a master's degree in applied positive psychology from the University of Pennsylvania. After graduation, she spent the next 5 years working as an assistant instructor to the program. A frequent speaker and a published author on well-being topics, Martha co-chairs the National Institute for Well-Being in Law's Policy Committee, is a member of the Utah Supreme Court's Board of Mandatory Continuing Education, and serves on the Board of Trustees for Intermountains Health Salt Lake Valley Hospitals. In 2023, the Utah State Bar recognized her exceptional service with the Utah Legal Well-Being Impact Award. Go ahead and please welcome Martha Knudsen.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me here. It's nice to see those of you that are out today and choosing to come and listen to us instead of going into the sunshine and the ski slopes. So I am here to just give you an overview on attorney well-being, right, and how the community of the practice of law and the legal profession is something that really impacts the health of individuals and also the community at large beyond just the profession. So as we are going to go through some of this stuff today. I just want to frame up a little bit about what it is that we're talking about. You'll hear me say mental health and well-being quite a bit. So any thoughts with the phrase mental health? Anybody have any words that come to mind when you think about that?
Give more context about that.
Yeah. All right. When I say mental health, what pops into your head?
I don't know. I know that. I'm saying, like, it's pretty broad, so I
Yeah.
don't really understand where it goes.
Yeah?
Self-care.
Pardon me?
Self-care.
Oh, I'm sorry. I can't understand you there.
Self-care.
Self-care. Okay, great. Awesome. Anybody else? I'll tell you what. Yes. Mental illness. Yeah. That's typically the kind of responses I get when I talk to groups of lawyers and even law students is you ask what people think when you say mental health, and they say depression, anxiety, mental illness, medication therapy, and all those things are a part of mental health and health, but there's so much more to mental health than just that. So what we're working on with the Wellbeing Committee and Utah's legal profession here, and what we're going to talk about today is thinking about mental health as a spectrum. It's so much more than just the absence of what we don't want, right? We have so many things that we've done over the years to try to remove what we don't want. It's so much more about building what we do want. And it's the strengths and capacities that help us to flourish as individuals and as in a community. Now, the Utah Supreme Court about 6 years ago put together a task force to look at lawyer and judge well-being. And this was on the heels of a large study showing that lawyers were not doing so well. I think everybody's familiar with the fact that lawyers and law students have higher rates of depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, and substance use disorder, right, than the general population. And so that's why this task force was formed. And Cliff and I, Professor Roski, have both served on this. And as we were looking into some of the recommendations to make for the Utah Bar and the law schools and our legal communities in the courts going forward, we really focused on not the getting rid of what we don't want, right? It's building more of what we do want. And so that's the approach that we've really taken. So let's see, where'd the clicker go? Clicker is there, we'll just do that. There you go. Okay, so as we talk about well-being today and mental health and what we're doing as a bar and how it impacts our communities, this is what we're coming at. This is the approach that we are taking, right? It is a positive strengths-based approach that's looking at the whole picture. Because mental health and well-being is health. We all have it all the time. It exists on a spectrum, and we are everywhere between thriving to barely surviving, everywhere in between. And most of where we sit on that has to do with the daily little habits of thought and interactions that we have, how our communities, the policies in our communities, the systems in our schools impact us, our interactions with other people. All those things come together to impact where we are, and we move up and down that spectrum every single day. And where we sit on that spectrum really very much matters. Here are some of the correlations that we have between being on the elevated side of the well-being spectrum and, unfortunately being on the lower side. So when you're on the higher side, it impacts everything that we do, that we care about as lawyers, as professionals, as individuals. So it impacts our physical and mental health. It impacts whether we like our jobs, how well our brains work, our memory, whether we're able to handle stress that comes with us as a part of life or as a part of the practice. It impacts our relationships. And the opposite here, we see these things are true. If your well-being is struggling, if we're not paying attention to that for ourselves and for our communities, then we see these we see these correlations on that other end. And because of this, our health and well-being with lawyers, judges, law students, it really does impact our ability to show up for our clients, to show up in our schools, to learn the things you're supposed to learn here, to go on and practice law in our communities. And because of that, the Utah Supreme Court has decided to make it very clear that paying attention to our mental, emotional, and physical health is bound up in our duties of competence as an attorney. And so building this into part of our system that governs how we practice. So I come from the positive psychology realm. And, I got involved in this because of my own struggles with burnout, depression, anxiety during the course of my practice. And I really was looking to see, is there a way to practice law? Is there a way to be engaged and enjoy what you do and be really good at it? And when you're looking at this through the lens of positive psychology, it tends to be so much focused on the individual, right? Building those strengths and capacities within us, not just getting rid of the stuff we don't want, but building the things that we do want. And we know we can develop certain things like this. Like science tells us there's all these capacities that we can build. So I come from this perspective of the individual. However, the individual is so important, but well-being doesn't just sit with us as people. It sits with us in our relationships, right? So we co-create our well-being with other people. It resides in organizations. Our well-being impacts the health of the organization impacts our health. And it also resides at the community level. All of these are distinct sites of well-being, but they're also incredibly interdependent. So something that our health, the health of our organizations, all this stuff really does matter on the broader scale for community health. There's pushback sometimes on some of these well-being things. It's like, well, you know what, that is your own business. You deal with that on your own time as an individual. That's not us as a collective. That's not our responsibility to focus on the health and the well-being of our community or our individuals. But I will tell you that is not what the science tells us. Happiness is contagious. Well-being is contagious. And so if we want to have thriving societies, if we want to have thriving organizations, thriving schools, thriving communities, then we need to be paying attention to the health and well-being of individuals and everything on those levels. So has anybody ever heard of the Framingham Heart Study? It is, I think, the longest longitudinal study in existence, and it was initiated in 1948 to investigate the causes of heart disease, the risk factors for heart disease. And they're now just enrolled, I think about 4 years ago, their third generation of people that they're following. And this study is a landmark study, really important for so many reasons, but for purposes of what we're talking about today and well-being and community, the researchers, they found that happiness and well-being is contagious. That those of us that are surrounded by other people that are healthy, like mentally healthy and happy, are more likely to be happy themselves. Now, this is not something that you just end up hooking up with a bunch of happy people because, you attract each other. It really is that the happiness, it extends out to like 3 degrees. So you to your friends or your family, and then from your friends' friends, and to your friends' friends. And we see this within communities. And these people that are in these pods that they found in the study that are happier, they had lower death by heart attack, lower risk of heart issues. So happiness is contagious, well-being is contagious. So when we are caring about the well-being of each individual as a discrete person, it is also having ripple effects out to our communities, out into our schools. We know that this is not just true in communities like they are looking at in the Framingham Heart Study. It's also been found within the context of schools, with the workplace. So this is something that it's important. So to the extent that as organizations, as law schools, as communities, as a legal profession, facilitate well-being through interventions focused on individuals, through policy, through looking at our systems, we aren't just increasing the happiness and well-being of one person. It has cascading effects on other policy. So what does this tell us that we can focus on? Like, there's so much stuff in terms of well-being and elements and strengths that we can build. So I wanted to focus on one thing today that could be useful to everybody to start applying in your own life and within your own systems. And that is a focus on, let's see, this is not, there we go. This is a focus on relationships. So in Framingham, we know that happiness is contagious. We also know that certain things like depression can be contagious. Loneliness is certainly contagious. Happiness tends to be stickier than some of these things, but the lesson from Framingham and relationships is that by cultivating relationships, and we can help stop some of that spread of loneliness, right? We can cultivate relationships, positive relationships that can then help us spread well-being. So one of the most well-researched elements of well-being for all of us, and this is across different time periods, different parts of the world, different research constructs of well-being, is that other people matter. This idea of the importance of connection, like you saw it in Framingham with the having it be cardioprotective to have these relationships and in this happiness, but it's something that has such a impact on all of us, these positive relationships. So it's not just that it's cardioprotective. We also see increased longevity, having positive connections with other people, higher goal attainment for ourselves and in our organizations, overall better mental health and physical health. So all of this tells us is that when we're looking at individual well-being and community well-being, it's that relationship that matters, right? It's the stuff that we can build for ourselves and then also looking outside of ourselves and building it with others. So how do we do this? Does this mean that we need to go out and be best friends with everybody and have these really deep relationships with everybody in our schools, everybody in our workplaces? No. What we're looking at here is the idea that you perceive that there is somebody else out there that values you. There's somebody else out there that cares about you. You can have these deeper relationships, yes, some of them, but when it comes to the big impact, a lot of this is just high quality connections, the kind of things that tell us every single day that communicate that we matter, right? There's that contagion that we get, happiness of other people. We're picking up messages all the time from others that tell us whether or not we belong and whether or not we matter. So the theory of high quality connections with this that you can take away today is to really consider all the little bits of interactions that you have every single day with one another, within just walking down the hall, whether you are making eye contact with somebody else, whether they're making eye contact with you, if people are speaking with you in respectful ways, if you're picking up whether or not your professor is treating you with respect, or somebody else in the classroom is treating you with respect, or in the community is treating you with respect. These are the kind of things that really have an impact on us. And, we all have these antennas that are up all the time. This is kind of where that contagion comes from happiness and well-being. And we're picking up cues. We don't even know necessarily that we're doing that. And as human beings, we have this drive to belong, right? And so if you perceive that you don't belong because of whatever little interaction you might have with somebody else, your well-being actually then decreases, your happiness decreases. So this is something that we all have an opportunity here, because the way we interact a lot of times, we may not know that we are communicating disrespect to other people, or the idea that they don't belong. And that's when we are looking at, the Civil Rights Week and the importance of our community mattering is really everything. We all have that fundamental need to belong, right? And to feel like that we matter in groups that are important to us. If we feel like we matter, our happiness is higher, our well-being is higher. If we perceive that we don't, it actually can register as physical pain in our brains. And any feeling of disconnect from our families or our communities, that feeling that we don't matter, or that feeling that we don't have access to different opportunities and different things like that, that really is something that can harm our well-being, and it's a driver and something that we all need to consider as we are looking towards helping individuals, and also putting forth like policies and organizational things that will communicate whether or not people matter. So I'm going to pass this over to Professor Roski to talk about his research and a little bit more of an emphasis on some of the strategies that he's looked into to help facilitate well-being in individuals and communities.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out. Now that Martha has set the stage by establishing a connection between community and well-being, I thought I would examine the well-being of two communities that are especially important to law schools: the community of practicing lawyers and the community of law students. Just to set expectations, this is a bad news, good news story. I'm going to talk about some problems that we have in the legal community and one of the many things we can do to address them. So let's start with the basics. Are lawyers well? Are we mentally healthy? For many years, surveys said that the answer was no. Since the 1980s, at least 30 surveys have found that lawyers experience high levels of burnout, stress, anxiety, depression, and alcohol misuse, among other conditions. The most cited of these surveys was published in 2016, written by Patrick Krill and funded by the ABA, the American Bar Association. It surveyed all practicing lawyers in 15 states and received nearly 13,000 responses, which sounds impressive. Whether it is, I'll get to in a minute. But you can see the results here. 28% of lawyers reported depression, 19 anxiety, 23 stress, and somewhere between 21 and 36 problematic drinking, depending on how you define that. 6 months after that survey was published, the ABA established a national task force on lawyer well-being. Within a year, the task force published a report declaring that lawyers were languishing in a well-being crisis and issuing a long list of recommendations to stakeholders. The profession's response to this has been impressive. 40 states, state bars have established lawyer well-being commissions, issuing new regulations, hiring consultants, and launching many initiatives. In 2018, 2/3 of law schools reported that they now offer students mindfulness, nearly half on-site counseling, and a third free yoga. An update on the counseling in 2021, 2/3 now report offering on-site counseling. So this is a movement that's underway at the state bar level and in the law schools for sure. The report from the ABA is only 6 years old, and the profession's response to it has developed into a bona fide movement. But 2 years ago, 2 Yale law scholars called the foundations of this movement into doubt. In an article in the Journal of Empirical Legal Studies, they claimed that prior surveys on lawyer well-being suffered from 5 serious methodological flaws. First, the samples were local, not national. They were volunteer samples, not random. They had low response rates, in some cases lower than 5% response rates. And they did not include comparison groups. And they asked inconsistent questions. So just to give you a sense, when Patrick Krill went out and got 13,000 lawyers to respond in 15 states, there's a lot more than 13,000 lawyers in 15 states. At best, the survey got about a 24% response rate. And the question is, who's responding? Because when you put out a survey on depression, for example, there's a possibility that depressed lawyers respond to that survey. And so you have what's called sample bias. So as a result of these problems, the authors claimed the surveys were not representative of all lawyers, they could not compare lawyers to other groups, and could not be compared to each other. To address these shortcomings, the authors analyzed mental health data from the National Health Interview Survey, often known as the gold standard of health surveys. This is a national representative sample collected by the U.S. Census Bureau in house-to-house interviews. To many people's surprise, they found that less than 1% of lawyers experienced serious mental illness. So I should say, lawyers are, does this have a pointer? Yeah, lawyers are here. It's people without a BA, without a college degree, people with a college degree, people with a master's or PhD, doctors, veterinarians, and dentists, and lawyers. So no elevated rates of serious mental illness among lawyers. And then similarly, they found that only 6% of lawyers experienced moderate or serious mental illness. And you can see there's little error bars here, those little black bars, that shows the confidence interval, like where they think the data could lie, somewhere in there. And so these rates, 6%, were significantly lower than the general public, which is not put on the graph, but can be ballparked by looking at these two, the BA and no BA, and were not significantly higher than doctors. By contrast, they found that 11% of lawyers reported excessive drinking, twice the rate among doctors, and higher than others with postgraduate degrees. But in this article, and when talking to the press, the authors were not shy about emphasizing the takeaway on mental illness. They said, quote, contrary to the conventional wisdom, lawyers are not particularly unhappy. Indeed, they suffer rates of mental illness much lower than the general population. Lawyer mental health is not significantly different than the mental health of similarly educated professionals, such as doctors and dentists. It's fair to say that this paper landed with a thud in the lawyer well-being movement. The whole movement was built on the premise that lawyers are suffering more mental illness and higher rates of alcohol and substance misuse. No one really knew what to say about it. This is a high-quality study done by, an economist who knows what he was doing. So no one has said anything. There's been no response to this paper. I found this state of affairs pretty unfortunate, so I called Ben Pyle, a brilliant economist at Boston University's law school. After talking it over, we agreed to see if the Yale paper's findings could be replicated in data from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, a bigger, better survey of mental health with twice the sample size and more clinical health measures, including clinically validated mental health measures. That is, psychiatrists going to people's houses and diagnosing them with mental illness to see if it corresponds to the survey response. This survey, known as the NSDA, is collected by SAMHSA, the federal government's leading authority on mental health and substance abuse. The contrast between these two surveys is stark, both in relative and absolute terms. So there's just a picture of how someone doing the NSDA. In the NSDA, 10% of lawyers experienced serious mental illness in the past year, as opposed to 1% in the NHIS. 10% is similar to the rate among the general public, but significantly higher than the rates among people with a college or graduate degree, and almost double the rate among doctors. I just want to point out for a second the way these graphs generally work. You see how they all kind of cascade from a top point on the left, then they go down to doctors, then they pop up again for lawyers. Putting lawyers aside, what you're seeing here is known as the education gradient. The more education you get, the lower rates of mental illness you're likely to have, and the lower rates of alcohol and substance abuse. Also, the higher rates of income. So that all tracks. The outlier on almost all of these graphs is lawyers. The fact that lawyers look like people that didn't earn a college degree is actually a cause for great alarm against the backdrop of an education gradient where people are getting, sort of better as they get more educated. And then in terms of moderate to severe mental illness, a common measure, 41% of lawyers experienced moderate or serious mental illness in the past year, as opposed to only 6% in the NHIS. 41% is significantly higher than the rates even among the general public, among people with a college degree or a graduate degree, and 26% higher than the rate among doctors. Because the NSDA, unlike the NHIS, has so many different mental health measures, we were able to cross-check our findings against several others, and they were remarkably consistent. On all measures, lawyers have higher rates of mental illness than doctors. In many cases, lawyers have higher rates of mental illness than people with a graduate degree or even members of the general public. Our data on alcohol misuse line up with our data on mental illness. If anything, the data on alcohol are even more alarming. 10% of lawyers, 1 in 10 lawyers, reports alcohol abuse or dependence. This is a diagnosable mental illness. It's what we used to call alcoholism. In the past year, just in the past year, more than double the rate among doctors and 35% higher than the rate among the general public. And then, and this is, I think, worst of all, a staggering 1 in 4 lawyers reports that they have driven in a vehicle while under the influence of alcohol in the past year. 1 in 4. That's 53% higher than the rate among doctors and more than double the rate among the general public. Now, there's much more to say here, but this is the crux of the paper. We're bringing together 2 national surveys to prove that the common wisdom on lawyer well-being is actually correct. I could get into the reasons that we think you should prepare the NSDA to the NHIS, but it feels like it's too in the weeds for today, but I'm happy to answer that in questions. Lawyers do experience higher rates of mental illness and alcohol misuse than similarly educated professionals, in some cases much higher. And our hope for this paper is to help the legal profession stay focused on solving these problems rather than trying to debate whether they actually exist, because we know that they do. And we are particularly concerned about the prevalence of alcohol use and dependence and DWI. The legal community clearly has a problem with alcohol. Both surveys agree on that. And we need targeted interventions to address these problems, like rides home from parties if there's going to be alcohol served, or better yet, parties where alcohol isn't served. But let's shift gears now. Let's talk about a new subject, mindfulness. Before I get started, I do want to be clear about this because it's easy to get the wrong impression from the talk I'm about to give. Mindfulness is one thing we can do to promote lawyer and law student well-being, but it's no panacea. It's not the only thing. It's not the best thing. It's one tool among many others. The problems that our communities face are structural. They are institutional. They cannot be eliminated without structural institutional changes. Mindfulness has a lot of benefits, but it does not by itself change institutions or cultural norms. But let's back up for a minute. I'm talking about mindfulness. Some of you may be new to the concept. What is it? Mindfulness is a practice of secular meditation. Just paying attention, try to do this as I say it, paying attention to what's happening right now in the present moment with a sense of acceptance. So what's happening? I'm talking to you. I'm kind of talking at you, frankly. Maybe you're bored. Maybe you're having trouble paying attention. That's fine. That's part of your experience. Just notice it. That's mindfulness. So, 3 elements. Paying attention, you know how to do that, to the present moment, right now, with a sense of acceptance. That's all. In 2019, I had just begun teaching a new course called Mindful Lawyering, in which I introduced law students to the practice of mindfulness and help them explore how it might make them better lawyers. In the process of developing the course, I noticed that in the ABA's well-being report, they had specifically called upon law schools to offer mindfulness meditation to law students. So they said, this is one thing you can do for law student well-being. And as I said, law schools were offering more and more such courses around the US, Indeed, I have students telling me that their law firms have meditation rooms in the law firm. But when I went looking for data on the subject, I really didn't find much. I found dozens of articles calling for mindfulness courses, but only one article exploring how they affected law students, and that study was totally inconclusive. There was plenty of data on the general public, even data on medical students, nursing students, psychology students, and others. So I decided, why not pull together a simple study on the students of my mindful lawyering class? I was lucky because I had amazing support. The faculty of the University of Utah's College of Social Work includes Eric Garland, one of the world's most foremost mindfulness researchers. The author of hundreds and hundreds of papers, Eric is the principal investigator on more than $50 million in mindfulness research grants. He does this for the Pentagon, the NIH, that kind of stuff. Eric and his team kindly took me on as a kind of charity project, because I don't know how to do this kind of thing, and walked me through the process of designing and implementing the kind of scientific study that could be published in a peer-reviewed journal. We recruited 31 students from my mindful lawyering class and 33 other second and third year students who were not taking my class. The core of my course was to offer guided meditations once a week and then rigorously help students establish a daily meditation practice on other days. That's the hard part, sitting even 5 minutes a day, every day of the week. We started at 5 minutes, we built up to 20 slowly by the 8th week of the semester. At the beginning and the end of the semester, we assessed the students in both groups using validated surveys. We measured many facets of well-being: stress, anxiety, depression, negative emotions, positive emotions, disordered alcohol use, and mindfulness. At the time, we didn't know that our study was going to be interrupted by a global pandemic. We started the study in January 2020, and we ended it in April 2020. On March 18th, the course shifted from an in-person format to a live online format, like so many courses around the world. That same morning of March 18th, Salt Lake City was hit by a 5.7 magnitude earthquake. The first major earthquake to hit our valley since Brigham Young founded the city in 1847. 60,000 people lost power, including several of my students. I will never forget guiding a Zoom meditation that morning at 10 a.m. while many of my students were still experiencing aftershocks and internet outages. Under the circumstances, it seemed pretty clear to the research team that the study was now hopeless. We could no longer hope, let alone expect, that mindfulness would improve the well-being of my students. After all, the entire planet was in shock. For so many people, everything we were trying to measure, stress, anxiety, depression, and alcohol use, were spiraling out of control. People were scrambling for toilet paper, the liquor stores were sold out. I don't need to tell you about this, you lived through it. But in this moment, the practice of mindfulness became a lifeline for everyone in the class, including myself. For me, the questions in this study were no longer abstract. Back then, I had already been diagnosed with major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and attention deficit disorder. Isolated in my house with a hardworking spouse and 2 toddlers, I was very grateful to have a community of adults with whom I could experience the new challenges of life in a global pandemic. In April 2020, 1 month into the pandemic, in the middle of final exams, we administered the second round of surveys to both groups of students. Our expectations were low, but when we saw the results, we were astonished. In spite of the circumstances, the students in mindful lawyering showed statistically significant improvements in everything that we measured: stress, anxiety, depression, positive affect, negative affect, alcohol misuse, and mindfulness. Oh, that doesn't work. That works. So here's the table showing only our students and the differences from time 1 and time 2. And the key thing to see is the asterisks. They indicate statistically significant differences. You can see them all the way up and down the line. And then here's the difference for the other group. These are the second and third years that didn't take the class. And as you can see, there are no asterisks because there were no significant changes from time 1 to time 2. But on some measures, we had noticed that there were some baseline differences between our 2 groups, differences that existed before the study started on the first measure. In particular, the students in mindful lawyering exhibited significantly higher levels of anxiety, stress, and negative affect, negative mood. and significantly lower levels of mindfulness than the other students. This is not surprising. People don't turn to mindfulness when they're doing great. They come to mindfulness because they're suffering, that they're not doing well. And indeed, this became quite real for me during the course of the study. In June of 2020, I ruptured 2 discs in my cervical spine, and the pain, it's not possible for me to describe. I mean, I can only describe it as suicidal level pain. And no medication that I was provided would treat it in any way. They said you can try Oxy if you want, it's not going to help. And I lived with that for about 6 months, and then they did a surgery, and luckily I'm pretty much pain-free. I did wake up with numb fingertips this morning, but years later, but I'm not in pain, which is a blessing. And then as this study was going to press, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, an extensive blood clot from here to here, and then liver cancer, which I'm now cured of. So I was suffering quite a bit, and that was all. The last 3 were within a space of 3 months. So mindfulness was not, and that brought me back to mindfulness. I went and practiced it in response to those situations, often for very brief periods of time, not gonna lie. I didn't sit and meditate for 30 minutes during some cancer treatment or something like that. It might've been for 3 seconds, but it was really important to me to know what to do. When I was faced with my own mortality, it wasn't a mystery to me. All I had to do was notice my breath, notice that I was still breathing, that I was still alive, and that got me through the next step in the process. But this fact in our study that the mindful lawyering students weren't really apples to apples with the other students when they started. They were more depression, more anxiety, more stress. That creates a statistical problem, because then you don't know if what's happening is they're just returning to the mean versus actually improving against the other students. Thankfully, people who understand statistics better than I were able to address that issue. They applied a statistical technique known as analysis of covariance to account for the differences. And even under that analysis, the students in mindful lawyering still reported less stress, less anxiety, less depression, less alcohol misuse, and more mindfulness. So here's a graph of that. So the mindful lawyering students are in black, and you can see, for example, stress all the way on the left drops precipitously from time 1 to time 2. That's the difference in stress from 0 down to almost about 7.5. The gray is the other students whose stress went up. And you can see for every measure, we had the desired effect. It flips when you get to positive mood, because that's a good thing, and it flips. FMMQ over there is mindfulness. You can see how much mindfulness went up for our students. And we were able to determine mathematically that the increases in mindfulness were strongly correlated with the increases in all of these other measures, indicating that it was mindfulness driving them, not anything else. In light of what I told you earlier, I think the change in alcohol misuse was especially encouraging. Existing studies suggest that for many lawyers, alcohol misuse begins in law school. And on average, the students in mindful lawyering did begin the semester as problem drinkers. But by the end of the semester, they had become normal drinkers, which I found to be a remarkable result, especially early in the days of the pandemic, when there were lines around the block for the liquor store. To be clear, I don't think I had anything to do with this. I have no doubt that if the students had taken a mindfulness class from another qualified instructor, they would have experienced similar results, just as I have for the past 20 years, and just as so many others have reported in so many studies. None of this is really anything new. It's just new that it works for law students. Again and again, studies have found that mindfulness improves individual well-being. But to bring it back to Martha's talk, does it build community? Is there any connection between the practice of mindfulness, which we typically do in solitude with our eyes closed, and establishing relationships, building community, or reducing discrimination and prejudice? There's much less work on this subject, but there is a handful of studies, and they're encouraging. What they find is that even a little bit, a smallest dose of mindfulness training can reduce discrimination and prejudice. I'll talk to you about 2 studies. One is a study conducted by Adam Luke and Brian Gibson in 2016, they took 124 white people and sorted them into groups. One group listened to a 10-minute guided meditation, mindfulness meditation, 10 minutes, that's it. Another group listened to a 10-minute description of the English countryside as a control, just totally, meaningless. Then all of them got together, in a lab, and played what is known as a trust game. The goal was to end up with the most money, and they had to decide how much money to give people whose photos were presented to them. 150 counterpart participants. They're not real participants, but they're just faces. And they're from faces of varying races. Under the game's rules, they knew that whatever amount they picked, the counterpart would get 4 times that amount, and the counterpart, before the interaction, had already decided, am I going to give half of it back to you? So it's a trust game. Should I give you a bunch of money? And maybe I'll get some back. All of the participants showed more trust, all of the white participants, right, showed more trust in the photos of white people than the photos of black people. But the participants who listened to the 10-minute guided meditation showed less prejudice. Here they are. They're on the left. 5 times less prejudice. This chart shows how much more money the participants gave to white people, and the bar on the left is the group who listened to a 10-minute guided meditation, and the bar on the right is the ones who listened to the English countryside. The studies are not limited to race. Another study there's some on age, on disability. This one that I'm about to tell you is kind of on disability, but it's such a compelling study, I really want to present it to you. Whether it's on disability or not is up for you to decide. This one took place in a waiting room. One group had participated before this waiting room in a 3-week self-guided meditation training using an app called Headspace. By the way, Headspace is an awesome app, and students can get it for $10 a year, which is an 85% discount. Another group participated in a 3-week self-guided cognitive training program using an app called Luminosity. For reasons that will become clear, I can't recommend Luminosity. Not only is it more expensive, but it doesn't achieve the same results, as you'll see. After 3 weeks, they were each individually invited to complete an experiment. The experiment was basically bogus. What the study was really about was what happened in the waiting room. Before the test, they were asked to sit in a waiting room that contained 3 chairs. When they arrived, 2 actors were already sitting in 2 of the chairs, so there's only 1 chair for you. After you sit down in the 3rd chair for a minute, a woman comes around the corner, walking down the hallway toward you. She's using crutches, and she's wearing a large medical boot, the kind you might wear after breaking a bone. She walks with difficulty, and she winces audibly when she walks. When she arrives in the waiting area, she gets actually as far away from you as she can and stops, lets out an audible sigh of discomfort, leans against the wall as if she's waiting for the experiment too. And the question is, who got up and gave her a seat? The actors were not going to do it. That was their training. They would sit and they buried themselves in their phones, make a clear sign they're not going to get up. And the participants who had completed the 3-week mindfulness training were 2.5 times more likely to offer her seat. So the blue is the ones who offered the seat, and the orange is the ones who did not. Of course, as you can see from this graph, mindfulness isn't everything. The people who practiced mindfulness still gave white people more money than black people, and more than half of the people who used Headspace still didn't give up their seats. But progress has never been perfect. It's always been a matter of degree. Practicing mindfulness is one way that we can build community with others. It's not the only way, and it may not be the best way or the most impactful way, but it's definitely better than not giving up that seat. Thank you.
There was a hand back there, I think.
Thank you. I was trying to type it in, but I'll just ask. So I also wondered if, do you think there's a correlation between the fact that lawyers may report a higher incidence of mental illness because they actually can do something about it? They can actually go get counseling. They can actually afford to pay somebody $125 an hour to get counseling, whereas lower socioeconomic groups really can't do anything about their mental illness, so it may go unreported. And then part 2 of the question was, do you think there's a correlation between the fact that lawyers may have more access to free alcohol at parties, at gatherings, etc., versus lower socioeconomic folks as well have to worry about food over alcohol.
The second one is a hard yes, right? I have some slide on the first one.
Well, he's getting the slide on the second when you talked about the difference of lawyers versus people in a lower socioeconomic status. So when we look at how lawyers are doing when, there's the reporting there to show that population has elevated levels of, all of these things that we don't want, right? We compare them to the general working population into, as Professor Roski showed you, kind of where the similar education levels are, because there is some, and correct me if I'm wrong with that, the socioeconomic situations are, they're not apples to apples, but they're not like apples to cucumbers, I guess is what I'm saying. Does that make sense? So I think that lawyers reporting more, I don't know that would be the case rather than somebody in a lower status, because they're, it's a self-report measure too. And those tend to be across the board decently reliable.
And then I happen to have actual slide. Oh, hold on, wait. I'm gonna get you actual slides on your question because it's a great question and we do have data on it. So I feel like I should, here, it's gonna be in here. Present.
I will say that I think lawyers typically do have better access to mental health services and education, right? Because of, one piece is the educational part of it. That in and of itself is going to be a big piece to have, that. And then there's also going to be within your organizations that you're working for, you might have more access to some of the services through the law schools, through your employer, through the bar, things that you can have and use that other folks won't. And then, there is a sense of fairness kind of an issue there if you're looking at it on a community level, right? That impacts the health of the community overall.
And so to your first question, there is a strong sort of current in the literature that mental health issues are so stigmatized in the practice of law that lawyers underreport. And we found quite the opposite. So this is the numbers on who received mental health treatment, and lawyers significantly more than the general public were likely to receive mental health treatment. Almost 1 in 5 lawyers reported receiving mental health treatment in the past year. Now that raises the question of, do they have more access? They're richer, they're more likely to be employed, better health insurance. And we were shocked to see this. This is actually measured in the NSDA. Did you need but not receive mental health treatment? And this might look interesting, but if you look at those error bars, they all overlap with each other. This is basically like a wash. There's not, and certainly lawyers are not breaking any records here. That dotted line is the general public, and lawyers are right on it. So it seems like there hasn't been, at least in this data, any evidence that resources are constraining people from getting mental health treatment, which is surprising, right? For sure. There is some evidence in the NHIS that might be a factor, particularly with people who don't have a BA, that they fall lower. But this stuff shocked. When I got this, I sent it back to the economist and said, it's wrong, figure out why it's wrong. And he said, it's not wrong, So that was really surprising, but it spoke directly to what you were concerned about. So I wanted to share it.
Professor, there we go. When was this data
So this
collected?
data is a bit old. This is 2006 to 2013.
Okay.
But that actually makes it this even more surprising, that lawyers were getting so much mental health treatment
Right.
10 years ago, because that was before the ABA launched its report, before there was a well-being movement, before there's all this concern and attempts to destigmatize mental health. You would think that the trend goes up from 2017 to now, and we don't have great data on that.
Right. So my question back here for you is, are you asking also about who's using mental health services and the rate of that, or access, or both?
Kind of both, because I would think that, one, it's those on socioeconomic, lower socioeconomic scale or less educated may not even know what resources are available to them. And then, they may not even know how to go about affording it or how availing themselves to it. So that was really kind of what I was thinking, that there is a correlation because your income allows you, and education allows you access to things that others don't have.
It's very possible. It's very possible that people on this chart without a BA, for example, don't know that they needed it, so they just said no. Right? That's distinctly possible. Right? There's a certain amount of educational attainment it takes to recognize when you have a mental health issue.
And that it's acceptable to say I need it.
For sure. Yep.
I think it will be interesting to see updated data on this post-pandemic. It seems, I've been in this space now since 2015, and just in the last however many years, the conversations that people are willing to have and the discussions and the acknowledgement that not just in the legal profession and these spaces, but everywhere, right? And people seeking treatment and those kinds of things. So it'll be interesting to see how just the change due to the pandemic, if it makes a difference on what you see here.
Yeah.
Fabulous question. We'll probably wrap up with one more question. I know we're almost at time, and I have just a couple more announcements. And so I saw two hands, perhaps.
I don't know if you answered this or not, but I struggle with sickness and depression. I've struggled with sickness and depression, but, which are intertwined. But my dad was a lawyer. He's passed on now. And did you say that the study of mental illness within the law profession has not only been studied recently or prior, like?
So it's been going on for 30 years, but I think it's fair to say that the quality of the studies for the first 30 years were not great. So the conclusions reached from them, like estimates of alcoholism, just to give you an example, are between 6% and 56%. And like neither of those can be true, So this is the second study. The NIH study was the first to take a national representative sample of everybody and pull the lawyers out, and then pull out other groups and compare them to each other, and then you get a better sense of, what the real prevalence is and how they compare to each other. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty new stuff.
Thank you.
Sure.
Awesome. So as we wrap up here, big round of applause for our presenters and researchers. That was amazing. And have a great, great day.